Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History by podcast. Today, Dr. Daniel McClellan returns to the channel. We're going to be talking about all the gods of the nations or idols. One of his other many articles he has on his WordPress website, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Okay, so what is it that you were trying to outline here for those that may not be familiar with this? I just want to start there with that basic question before I get to the more complex ones.
So this is addressing how we read monotheism into the text of the Hebrew Bible, and specifically there are two passages, one in 1 Chronicles 16:26 and another in Psalms 96:5, that say, "For all the gods of the nations are idols, but Adonai made the heavens." And there are a number of scholars and a lot of lay people who interpret this as a statement of strict monotheism, that this is rejecting the existence of other gods. It's labeling them all as idols. And when we hear idols, we understand that to mean material representations of deity that are not divine, but are just handmade products of human industry, and therefore inanimate materials, inanimate matter, and not remotely deity. And in the post that I have up, I address a specific manifestation of that claim. This is from a book that I reviewed a few years ago called "Monotheism and Adonai's Appropriation of Baal" by James Anderson. And they make the claim that these passages are a statement of strict monotheism. And what I wanted to point to was the fact that the word that is translated idol here is not isometric with this concept of an idol as just an inanimate object. The word is elim in Hebrew, which means something like worthless things or useless things, and it has become associated with idols. It is a pejorative way to refer to idols, but it is not rooted in identifying idols. It is just saying they're worthless. It's a bit of rhetoric. An example that I frequently use, that I'll use in a paper I'm giving on monotheism in a couple weeks in Denver, where I grew up in Colorado. So I'll point out that it's like me saying the Las Vegas Raiders are not a real football team. I'm not actually denying that they are an incorporated football team that plays in the NFL. It's rhetoric. And so we've got the same thing going on here with this passage. And since I published this, there was a wonderful paper that came out in 2020 written by a friend of mine named Christopher Hayes, entitled "Enlil, Isaiah, and the Origins of the Elim, a Reassessment." And in there, Chris argues that Elim is probably a corruption of the word Enlil, which was a deity from Mesopotamia. And the NL consonant cluster there at the beginning of Enlil, in Hebrew, when you have consonant clusters like that, and particularly with the N letter, they frequently do what's called harmonization, or the N will turn into the L. And so we get Elil, or in the plural, Elilim. And so his argument is that this is a way to denigrate the gods of Mesopotamia. And it originates in Isaiah, in Deutero-Isaiah, which is most likely was written either during or after the Babylonian exile. So it would be responding to a lot of the religious or the worship circumstances in Mesopotamia. So in other words, this term Elim is probably a derogatory reference to the main god of Mesopotamia, and a way to dismiss the gods as not non-existent, but irrelevant. As far as we're concerned, they don't matter. They're not as powerful. They're not as relevant. All the gods of the nations are worthless. And so it's not a statement of strict monotheism. It is a bit of rhetoric that is intended to denigrate the gods of the nations. And that's probably more words than I actually used in the post that I published.
So I take it that he does not think that the Canaanite god El is Enlil. He's just saying that Elohim is a is a derogatory reference against Enlil and his pantheon?
Well, elim, yeah, which is an elim, which may be this corruption of the name Enlil in the plural, also sounds an awful lot like Elohim, and looks an awful lot like it too. And so it's a rough approximation that is intended to be slightly pejorative. So, like if somebody has an unfortunate name that maybe rhymes with something derogatory in, elementary school, people are going to just shift to that derogatory nickname and use that as a pejorative. And in a similar way, we have some places in the Hebrew Bible where they take names and shift them just a little bit to make them more derogatory, such as Baal Zevul. We know this prototypically as Beelzebub. That's what we see. That's the spelling that we see in the Hebrew Bible. In the New Testament, the Greek renders Baal Zevul, which is the real name. Beelzebub is a corruption. It's supposed to approximate the real name, but they've replaced the word for prince with the word for flies. And so instead of Lord Prince or Baal the Prince, you have Lord of Flies. And so that's a way to kind of approximate the word or the name while making it pejorative. And so the argument is that Elim probably comes from a corruption of the name for one of the head deities in Mesopotamia while the Judahites were in exile there.
So how does he look at Deuteronomy chapter 32 when Adonai inherits Israel from El? Does he not think El is also Enlil, or does he think they're separate? What's the deal there?
So these are two different pantheons. Mesopotamia is the East Semitic pantheon, and then El would be a part of the Northwest Semitic pantheon. And no doubt there's probably some correlation between the two, but no, Enlil is a different deity from El. There's some similarities in roles that they share. But I don't know that a lot of scholars would say the two are equated. I think there may be some influence, but for the most part, they're distinguished as two very different deities.
So do you think that Adonai is taking over the role of Baal very often in the text? His attributes.
Pardon?
And his attributes?
I do. I think that Adonai, when they come into the land of Israel, into the northern hill country, we can't really reconstruct with the data that are available at this point what their divine profile may have been like. There are some scholars, Nisin Amsalag is one who argues that Adonai was likely a deity of metallurgy or a volcanic deity from around Midian in the south before coming into the northern hill country, but they seem to have adopted a Northwest Semitic storm deity profile. And so Adonai takes over a lot of the roles, a lot of the features that are most prototypically manifested in Baal or Hadad or Baal Hadad. Such as control of the lightning, control of the weather, control of subterranean waters, and things like that. And so we have, a couple of very clear examples of this. Psalm 29, we have this, I believe, this sevenfold repetition of how the Kol Adonai, or the voice of Adonai, does all these things that relates it to lightning. And it mentions a bunch of place names, but these place names are all located further to the north in Phoenicia, in Lebanon, the places where Baal is the main deity. And so one theory is that this was originally a hymn that praised Baal as the master of lightning and thunder and all these things, and that it was then taken over by Adonai. And there's another example where we actually have the original source text. Isaiah 27:1 praises Adonai for defeating Leviathan. And it calls Leviathan the wriggling serpent and the twisting serpent. And these words in Hebrew are directly cognate to the Ugaritic words used in a part of the Baal cycle, which praises Baal for defeating Lotan, which is the Ugaritic equivalent of Leviathan. And it also calls Lotan the wriggling serpent and the twisting serpent. And so, but that text predates Isaiah 27 by probably 600 years. And so while it's unlikely that Isaiah was drawing directly from that text, Isaiah was definitely drawing from a tradition that stems from or was directly influenced by that tradition. And so that's another example where Adonai is basically doing for the Israelites what Baal does for the folks of Ugarit. And this is why there's so much conflict directly between Baal and Adonai. So the contest with the priests of Baal, between Elijah and the priests of Baal. What are the deities called upon to do? Send down lightning to set on fire this offering. And that's because they're both occupying roughly the same territory. They are both asserting their sovereignty over the storms, over the lightning, over inclement weather. And only Adonai is able to send down the pillar of fire or the lightning and completely consume the offering with fire. And that has everybody shout out Adonai, Hu Ha-Elohim, Hu Ha-Elohim. He is the deity. He is the deity, as a way to say, clearly Adonai is the storm deity in this region, not Baal.
So, do you think that different authors had different opinions about how to look at idols in the Old Testament? Because it looks like that some of them think that the other gods of the other nations, are just simply idols, while other texts, like we've discussed in prior interviews about just the whole deal of Kemos repelling the Israeli attack on Moab, appearing to contradict the idea that, oh, that god's not just a lifeless idol, as it turns out. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there is some polemic in the Hebrew Bible that scholars have labeled anti-idol polemic, and it's primarily in places like Deutero, Isaiah, and elsewhere. But Mark Smith has published a little bit on the logic of anti-idol polemic, and what scholars try to do with this polemic is try to figure out the degree to which these criticisms, this polemic against idols, accurately reflects what was going on with the idols versus represents kind of a mischaracterization, a caricature of what's going on, if they're just kind of treating them as something that they weren't actually. And I would probably fall in line with those scholars who think the texts don't fully and accurately reflect the logic of idols and their utility. For instance, in Deutero Isaiah, there's some ways that they're mocking the idols and saying that these people are worshiping deities of wood and stone that have no eyes, have no ears, have no mouth. And it's not that they're worshiping these deities of stone. What they're doing is using the idols, the divine images, to channel the agency of the deity. And I make a pretty strong argument that we need to better understand the logic of divine images to understand what's going on there. And we have very similar things going on in the Hebrew Bible. The Ark of the Covenant does everything that a divine image does. And the Hebrew Bible represents it in many ways as a divine image. So if we take the anti-idol polemic as 100% isometric with reality and accurate, then we have this disconnect. Well, why is the Hebrew Bible representing certain things as functioning similar to the way idols do, if out of the other side of their mouth they're mocking and denigrating it as this stupid, look at these people worshiping rocks, when that's not what they're doing at all? And Israel is doing very much the same thing. And I've argued in the book that recently came out that a very similar intuitive impulse is manifested in the way that people today may go talk to a headstone in a cemetery as kind of a material index for the presence, for the agency of a deceased loved one. And that's not because we've reasoned it all through and decided that this is all perfectly rational and logical. It's because it's a perfectly intuitive way to feel when we are seeking the presence, the agency of somebody like a deceased loved one. And so this is something we see a lot in behavior in cemeteries, and it's represented in books and films and TV shows as well. So I think the logic of divine images is something that is a lot more natural to the human condition, and something that survives down to today, even among populations that would identify themselves as thoroughly secular. And so I think the anti-idol polemic of the Hebrew Bible is rhetoric in a very similar way that the all the gods of the nations are idols rhetoric is rhetoric. It is exaggerating, it is hyperbole, it is intended to denigrate more than it is intended to accurately represent what's going on with these folks' enemies.
Do you think that the story of the whole Moab Israel Kemos thing could represent a pre-Torah view on idol worship, or is this a post-Torah view of idol worship?
I think this is most likely pre-Torah, or at least this is a tradition that was handed down from a period before the Pentateuch came together, which is probably something that happened in the Persian period. And I think this is probably a story that dates in some form or another to the pre-exilic period. And it may be a way to account for why Moab was able to throw off their vassalage. The authors may have known that they needed to explain this somehow. They needed to account for how Moab could have gotten away without being returned to subjugation. And this was the idea that the king sacrificed his heir, and that catalyzed Chemosh's anger, and Chemosh came out and drove the Israelites off. That's kind of embarrassing, which is why it's kind of passed over quite quickly and a little covertly. But it matches thematically exactly what happened with Sennacherib's invasion and siege of Jerusalem, where he was most likely going to take the city, and then through divine intervention was run off and was unable to return the city to vassalage. So I think it may represent kind of the antithesis to what happened with Sennacherib, and a way to account for this embarrassing loss of Moab as a vassal. But yeah, I would say that almost certainly predates the formation of the Pentateuch.
So do you think that the authors of the Pentateuch, the Torah, were trying to overcome some of these older traditions that a god there and a god over there might have defeated Adonai in battle, and they were trying to paper that over, ignore that, create new stories that would obfuscate that, and get the people to look at better stories and make Adonai a more powerful deity?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a degree to which they're trying to renegotiate their understanding of their own past, and hold up Adonai as someone who's sovereign initially over just Israel, but by the time of the Persian period, their sovereignty needed to be expanded to all the earth. And so, yes, they're writing new stories. Psalm 82, I've argued, is an example of this moment of universalization, where the gods of the nations are deposed, are condemned to mortality, so that Adonai can then be called upon to rise up, inherit all nations, and basically take over direct rule of all the nations, and in that way become accessible to all Israelites throughout the world, rather than only those in Israel. And so I think there are a variety of ways that they're trying to remember the past. Now, some of that involves altering some of the texts, but there were most likely also stories and texts that were either well known enough or recent enough in memory, or had material remains still around for consultation that made it a little more difficult for them to alter inconspicuously. And I think there's more work to be done on why this story in 2 Kings 3 remains the way it is. But I think that it was rushed through quickly and kind of furtively enough that it left enough ambiguity to be reread in different ways. So I imagine that when they were putting together the Pentateuch, that this text when they had an opportunity to influence how it was understood. It was probably repackaged, renegotiated to be understood in a slightly different way. But I think the original sense of Kemos running off the invading force still shines through for those willing to accept that. For those who don't want to accept that, that's nonsensical, and other readings are more logical. So that's how I imagine Judahites during the Persian and the Hellenistic and the Roman periods probably looked at that story.
We have a super chat question from Ben Halamila. I hope I pronounced that name right. The question is, I really would like to hear Dr. Dan's view and counter to Dr. Eisenman's theory and James Valiant's theory. Thank you for the super chat, Ben.
What theories in particular is this referencing? Is this the Jesus mythicism theory?
No, both of them believe Jesus existed, so no, they're not.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I apologize to both of them, though. I'm not aware of what theory is being referenced here.
I think Eisenman has several theories, although I think arguably the most prominent one is his theory on the Dead Sea Scrolls being much later than the conventional dating. And James Valiant's theory would be the Roman provenance theory, but his version of it is drastically different than Joseph Atwill's.
Okay. I don't know the details of either's theory well enough to be able to critique either competently, adequately enough. But that's interesting that Eisenman thinks the Dead Sea Scrolls come from a later time period, so post 70 CE, or just that they don't. What's that?
He thinks that like the sectarian documents, like the Damascus document, Pesher Habakkuk, are first century CE texts, and that the righteous teacher is James the Just. That's his theory.
Oh, okay. So it's a little bit of integration with early Christianity. Is that one of the ideas?
Yeah, in a way, he thinks like they come from a hardcore zealot Torah Orthodox movement that was converted into some sort of Hellenistic form of Judaism that was called eventually became Christianity. That's kind of his argument, but that's not all of it. More complicated than that.
Oh yeah. I imagine it's always hard to try to reduce somebody's whole work down to something short like that.
Right.
That's I'd have to look more into that theory. I have some good friends who have done a lot of really good work in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have they feel pretty strongly that the dating that we have is pretty accurate. So I wouldn't argue against them just flippantly, but I apologize for not being able to provide more information to your audience member. I hope that's not too disappointing, but I think that both of these theories strike me as far enough of a departure from the consensus view that I would think twice about accepting them without seriously considering the data that has been accumulated by the consensus views, because these are not kind of fly by the seat of their pants scholars who've put these things together. This is decades of research by a number of the world's leading scholars, and so I don't challenge them lightly. So I would I don't know how else to address my inability to to address their theories, apart from saying I would think twice about accepting theories that go so drastically against the consensus view.
And what hasn't helped is the two people that were mentioned in that super chat have been often confused as mythicists.
Yeah, and I guess I fell into that trap too, huh?
Yeah, they're not. Those two are definitely not mythicists. And there are others that I've had on my channel that have been mischaracterized as mythicists. Like Marcus Vincent, for example, who's doing a lot of patristic work. He's a patristic specialist that puts the New Testament significantly later. And I've noticed that. That the consensus. What's interesting to me is the consensus has changed over time too, as new data has been found. So that's the other thing that's interesting. I've noticed that several scholars over time have been moving the Gospels to the second century CE, but I don't want to talk about that too much because we're going way off topic from
Yeah,
what we're supposed to be discussing right now.
I am in the middle of this book right
Oh
now.
yeah, I have that one.
Yeah, that is trying to move the Gospels in the opposite direction.
Yeah,
But
that's,
I have some concerns with that as well. Um,
yeah.
but I will, in order to try to do any justice at all to the super chat question, I will look into those gentlemen's theories, and so in the future, if that comes up again, I will try to have a more informed response for you.
Hmm. So do you think that say Kings, for example, that has the whole Kemos story in there about the whole Moab thing and Israel and whatever. Could that be based on potentially earlier written sources that were lost that we don't have?
I think it's no doubt based on earlier written sources. I think a lot of scholars are of the understanding that the Deuteronomistic literature and later priestly literature was largely a redaction of earlier kingly annals, royal histories that had been kept, and they were taking chunks here and there and working them into a narrative that better served their interests. And so, in a similar way, the books of Chronicles, most scholars think, are doing the similar thing with the books of Samuel and Kings. Only both of them happen to survive in the text. And so, just like there are things in Samuel and Kings that don't end up making it into Chronicles, and we can see some of the ways that Chronicles um, has reshaped some of the narrative. And Chronicles is also probably pulling from other sources as well to inform the way they're shaping the narrative. But that gives us an interesting look at uh, what was likely a large chunk of the source text, and then what came out the redactional other end with the Book of Chronicles. So there are other texts that are mentioned in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles where they say, "Is this not written in this text over here?" And we don't have that text. And we have some references in the Mesha inscription to some events that may be related to what's going on in 2 Kings 3 as well. So most likely there were some, I don't know if they were monumental inscriptions or if they were just court records or royal records that were kept, but most likely Kings is kind of a distillation, a redaction of a larger collection of earlier texts.
Final question. Do you think that different authors in the Hebrew Bible had different opinions on how to look at the multiple gods? Do you think some of them thought there were no other gods, others thought there were?
I don't think that any of the authors of the Hebrew Bible thought that no other gods existed, just because I think that's more of a philosophical position. And there's not a lot of writing in the Hebrew Bible that is philosophical in orientation. There is some that gets into that a little bit, but that has more to do with questions of theodicy and things like that. And so that kind of bleeds into questions of other deities, but they don't really reject the existence of other gods. Primarily, they're rejecting the significance of other gods to the Israelites. I think they absolutely had different understandings of their natures and their significance, and had different positions on which ones needed to be addressed, which ones didn't, which ones were more important. And a lot of this had to do with their circumstances. If Egypt was the main problem, then they were probably going to be addressing Egyptian deities. If it was the Hittites or the Aramaeans, they were probably going to be addressing their deities. If it was Moab or Midian, going to be addressing their deities. When they're in Babylon, when Assyria is when they're vassals to Assyria, they're going to be addressing their deities. So they all have different sets of circumstances, and they're inheriting perspectives from earlier periods and are having to negotiate between their heritage and what's going on now. and that results in different perspectives that then get passed on to the next generation that's going to have to renegotiate those in light of still different circumstances. And so it's a very complex ebb and flow. It's not nearly as linear as some people want to make it. And but the one thing I don't think that we see is a philosophical rejection of the existence of other deities. Because even when we get into the New Testament, and even when we get into early Christianity, the other deities are still there. They've just been repackaged. They're angels, they're demons, they're principalities and powers, and they're all these things that still function the same. They've just been subordinated more directly to the God of Israel, and they've been renamed. But within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we still frequently see them referred to as Elohim, as Elim, as children of God. And their roles have just been negotiated a little bit. So I think it's very complex. There are lots of different perspectives, which makes it difficult to reduce it to a linear development. But I disagree with scholars who suggest that any texts in the Hebrew Bible are denying the existence of other gods in any way that we would find meaningful.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. McClellan.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.